Hello, and welcome to Bible Study with Hans and Dan. We have finished up with the book of Mark and are starting a new study, but I want to let you know that if you didn't get all of the studies from Mark, you can still look on the website there, the church website or the YouTube site, and pick those up and go back and go through all of those. But we're going to start now going through some of the Psalms.
And we had asked when we started the book of Mark for some of you all to maybe work on a logo and some graphics for us to really help us go viral, and we're still waiting, so we'd love to have somebody with some artistic ability to give us a logo that says Bible Study with Hans and Dan online. So you can help us out with that.
And so hopefully we won't make it through this whole next study before we get that.
Right.
So as we start out in Psalms, the Psalms are a really neat book that a lot of people love for all sorts of different reasons. They've been romanticized, and we skip over a lot of how real the Psalms are.
We quote the parts of the Psalms that sound on the hopeful side, and we don't talk a lot about the valley of the shadow of death side.
Right. And they always go through that before they ever get to the hope. And we like to just skim over that, but we need to look at that, especially where we are today, to understand that throughout history, God's people went through tough things before getting to the hope. And we can associate with some of that. And it's interesting, even in our culture today, in the church culture, how we just sort of amplify the negativity of everything else except in the Psalms.
Right. And so let's talk about that, because I think it's just interesting to me. We often complain about how negative the culture is about stuff, and you can certainly hear that in the news cycle of the day, but we amplify that.
Right.
In the church, if we put it in preacher language, on a Sunday morning, you preach a sermon or something happens at church, and 25 people tell you how well it went, and one person tells you, maybe it could have been better, and you kind of fixate on the one.
That's right.
And churches have often, and we've seen this, and you've seen this as well, we can see God's activity around us and be all excited about that, but one voice kind of pulls us to another place. But what's interesting to me is in the Psalms, we kind of flip that, and we kind of drown out some really, the struggles of the psalmist, and just act like everything's wonderful.
It's just the hymn book.
Yeah, and that's not the story of the Psalms.
No. And the Psalms do such a good job of covering life.
Right.
And they cover loss.
Right.
They cover grief. Not just loss of life, but loss of all sorts of parts of life.
Right. And so I think one of the reasons we think this is a good study for us to do right now is in some way, shape, or form, we're all dealing with grief.
Right.
And like most people in most churches, we compartmentalize grief. And so when we're having a conversation on grief in this church, we say, well, we have the Grief Share Ministry.
Yes.
And get Hans and Joyce and Jane and some of those folks together, and let's talk about Grief Share, or talk about Stephen's ministry. But we need to talk about grief in a much broader way right now.
Right.
Because here's what happens for some of us when we're in grief, probably what Hans and I dealt with. March 13th, we knew we were not going to have church on March 15th. And at that point, we thought it would be an interruption.
Right.
And I can remember thinking then, I hope we'll be back for Easter, right? Easter Sunday. So 4 weeks later, or 3 weeks later, whatever that was. And that was how your mind is, because when you're confronted with something has been taken from you, you have no control over it. And so you kind of get into hyperactivity mode. So everything we've done online, you all probably got an email from me on the Monday, March 16th that said, here's 20 things we can do online. Because, you just kind of go into hyperactivity mode. And I know your other workplace at the Culpeper, you're dealing with the crisis. And so now you're you're helping with dining services, and you're just making
Right.
sure everybody's okay. And that's a good thing about grief.
Yes.
But at some point, you got to go through what you have lost.
Right. Right.
Um,
And admit it.
Right,
We look at the culture and we look at the news now, and you see people so angry.
right.
And a lot of that is displaced anger.
Yes,
Because it's a loss of something, and they're not calling it
right.
that.
It's the loss of, I'm not in control anymore.
Right,
It's the
right.
loss of the direction I had for my child's life, that they would go through school, and we kind of
Mm-hmm.
close a school year like we normally do, and that's been taken away
Mm-hmm.
from us. You know, it's the very real loss of jobs and,
Right.
and income and retirement accounts and all of that kind of stuff. But we got to deal with the grief.
Yes.
And so we think the Psalms will give us a really, you know, perfect picture of how to deal with grief and how to go through it.
Well, and the Psalms, we'll have to be careful through the Psalms, because the Psalms really go against our culture in that they let us know we're not in charge.
Right.
Over and over again throughout the Psalms, whether it's David or one of the others that is writing or dictating the Psalm, they realize they are not in charge.
Right.
And we don't like that.
Right. And, you know, and David is not in charge, and again, various points of his life, but at some point we refer to David as King David,
Yes.
the most powerful man on the earth in his time at some point in his life. And he says, and we, in our culture, we chase that.
Yes.
If only we had more of something, we'd have more power and more control of our lives. And no matter where you are in the spectrum right now, we've lost control.
Right.
And so we've gone from maybe we'd have Easter Sunday to that conversation that, you know, you and I follow a lot of blogs and a lot of wider church conversations, denominational conversations, and everybody was saying the week before Easter, hey, when we come back, that we'll make it a real big kind of Easter Sunday, but that'll be kind of May. Well, here we are, and it's the week of the 1st of May, and I really don't have any idea of a calendar date I could say, I think our church will be open like it once was. And so, you know, we spend time with other folks and ministry leaders, and I've spent some time with some ministry leaders here in the last few weeks especially, and at some point to just say, the church we all knew and led, whatever that church is, that church doesn't exist anymore.
No.
And there's grief about that.
Yes.
Right?
Oh, absolutely.
Don't move to the activity. Don't move to the opportunity in the grief. Don't move to the new life yet. Let's grieve about what has been lost. And
Right.
so we hope the Psalms will help frame the grief we all need to experience together. And so, you know, we need to say this a lot. If you're struggling with grief today, you know, call us. Reach out to another person in the church. You know, we have ways to help, and sometimes the ways to help is just listen.
Yeah.
Not answer
Often.
the question of grief, but just listen to the grief and deal with it. So,
Well,
go ahead.
the Psalms also are very crucial for answering life questions.
Right.
Which, right now, in the midst of crisis, we redefine a lot of our life questions and find out, well, who am I really?
Yeah.
Where am
Yeah.
I really? And we ask those questions that are so deep, and sometimes the answers scare us. But the Psalms does a good job of going through some of
Right.
those.
So we got to deal with the grief, and we
Yes.
got to also answer these kind of worldview, meaning of life questions.
Right.
And you know, we've kind of put some out that we're thinking through. But who are we? You know, before March 15th, I could have told you who I was in the context of what I do with a group of people. You know, who are we is a foundational question. Where are we? We all feel displaced
wow.
right now.
Yes. Yes. Everybody.
What's wrong? And it's interesting because of grief. We are transitioning in our culture, maybe in our world. What's wrong at first was a virus.
Yes.
And now what's wrong is multiple layers of response to the virus, depending on who you want to talk to. What's
Right.
wrong is who's to blame.
Right. And that question's going to continue to change.
Right, right. And permeate into multiple levels now. It's been a high level question and who's to blame, but that'll come on down
Yes.
to the folks who yell at the grocery store clerk because they're out of whatever they need.
Right.
What's the solution? And we're all looking for that right now. That's the natural tendency.
Oh my, yeah.
How do we do church? That's the question I almost wake up with every day. I want a solution. I want somebody to tell me
Right.
what to do. When you're over at the Culpeper, I know, what's the solution to social isolation that's been happening? And then what time is it? And I think the beauty of the Psalms is it gives us a long sense
Right.
of God's timing.
Right.
The bigger picture and also the urgency of God's timing. So we'll kind of use these in some way as foundational questions.
And then again, going back to it, the Psalms really is a hymn book.
Right.
It really and truly
It is the hymn book.
song book that Jesus would have used, that so many of those patriarchs that we talk about would have used. These
Right.
were the songs they would have sung. And so they've been around for thousands of years. So they're important to us today.
Right. And, we won't jump on this track, but, the amount of conversation we've heard over the hymns of our day, right, are the hymns that were 100 years old better than the hymns that are a year old, and all that kind of stuff. And so much of that could have been avoided if we would have started with the Psalms as the hymn book and of our faith. And, there are some great hymns that are meaningful to all of us, and there are
Absolutely.
some new songs. I was listening to one this morning that was really encouraging to me.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we misplace this when we don't understand that the Psalms give us the roots of
those.
every expression of praise to God. So, all right. So we're trying to frame for you in this session and in our next session a way to read the Psalms and talk about them. When we were doing the Gospel of Mark study, we said the foundational question that Mark is trying to answer is, who is Jesus? Now, did he talk about some end time stuff? Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Did he talk about how to relate to the government? Sure. Did he talk about family issues? Yeah, he did all of that. But those weren't foundational.
Right.
The foundational question was, who is Jesus? And I say about the Psalms, we need to figure out what the foundational questions are, or what the author is trying to do, so that we're better able to apply what the words say to our lives. So let me give you a quote from N.T. Wright that I really like, and N.T. Wright's a pretty brilliant theologian, talking about the Psalms. Sing these songs, and they'll renew you from head to toe, from heart to mind. Pray these poems, and they'll sustain you on the long, hard, but exhilarating road of Christian discipleship. And I think that captures well what the Psalms have meant for people throughout human history. What were Paul and Silas singing in that jail cell? They might have been singing the latest contemporary hymn, but I'm guessing it was something from the Psalms. And it's in those dark of the night moments that people have prayed these psalms, have said them out loud, have sung them, and and I love how N.T. Wright, the long, hard but exhilarating road of Christian discipleship. It's not easy.
Nope.
It's not happy. It's not joyful. It's long and hard, but it's exhilarating, and it leads us to Christ.
It's amazing how often throughout the Bible you find that out.
Right.
It's
Right.
hard.
Right. All right, let's get into a psalm today before we close out a session. So we're going to use a psalm today, and we're not going through any chronological order. We'll be bouncing around. If you have a favorite psalm, put it in the comments section. We'll probably do it. We're not going to do all of them, okay? This isn't going to go on for 2 years, but we'll do this for a while. So today we picked the 100th Psalm. And this is a psalm. If you've been to a funeral that I am a part of, I probably have read this scripture. I read this scripture a lot with people that are at the end of their life and have always found it very meaningful. So let me read it to us and then try to apply those questions that we just talked about to this psalm. So shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs. Know that the Lord is God. It's he who made us, and we are his. We're his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good, and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. All right, so let's kind of just think about that psalm in the sense of the questions we were just talking about. So who are we? Well, the psalmist says we're His.
His. That's it.
We're not ours.
And that's a basic presupposition of all of the Psalms.
Yes. And that's so powerful, because if I'm not mine and my children aren't mine, we're all His. And I can live life with freedom because He's got this.
What pressure that relieves.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, a thing we need to maybe do each day is say this: it's He who made us. We are His. Where are we? Well, we're in His pasture. The psalmist says we're on His earth. We're not on our land. We're in His pasture. That very symbol of somebody else is taking care of me. I'm not some wild animal out. I'm in a pasture with God.
I have a caretaker who
Right.
cares.
Yeah. What's wrong in this world? Now, this psalm, on some other psalms, we'll get that pretty clear.
Yes.
This one maybe is a little nuanced as to what's wrong in this world, but I think there seems to be an underlying question of who is God and who we are. And you just don't know what the psalmist might have been going through, but I think a lot of us are asking kind of those questions. Where is God? Who is God in all of this? And who are we?
Right.
And what's our role in His world in the midst of this? What's the solution? We see several things there. Hans, talk about some of the solutions we see in this passage.
Praise and thanksgiving. We don't generally think of those as solutions. We're in the midst of a problem. Those are generally things we just think about in celebration. But the psalmist uses those as solutions even in the midst of the darkness and the loss.
And probably the most sacred privilege that you and I have is to be with people who in the hardest moments of life, in some way, it might be really soft or it might be more out loud, but they are moving towards praise and thanksgiving even in the midst of that. And you say, wow.
Right.
Whatever kind of believer that person is, I want to be like that.
Yes.
And like you said, it's our natural reaction, whether it's grief, whether it's we're not in control in this world, is to try to grab control.
Yes.
The psalmist says, no, go to praise, go to thanksgiving, go to joy. And again, what kind of church are we going to be on the other side of this? What kind of people are we going to be? I hope if we would develop the habits of even now saying, God, yeah, it's an incredible world we live in. We are taping this. It's Wednesday, and it's a beautiful day outside.
Yes. Yes.
And there's much to be thankful
And it's
for.
a different day than we've seen before, but it's still a beautiful day.
Right. And then what time is it? And this is why I read this passage so often at funerals and when I'm with somebody who is dying. God's just not faithful today.
Right.
Throughout all generations. And so, in that theological world that I can't quite get my head around, to know that God is fully present with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and He's fully present with you and me today, and He's fully present in our tomorrows, all at the same time. He is the God of generations. We live in the constraints of a time. A chronological world. He doesn't. And so to understand, hey, God is being faithful through all of life. So that's an example of how we could use kind of the questions that we are going to use throughout this study to kind of look at a psalm. Let's end with some closing questions. And we love doing this, and you have been so kind and encouraging to us in our Gospel of Mark study. But we do need you to do a little better job on the closing questions. We're too nice to check the homework, but we need you to start checking the homework.
Even though it's not graded.
So our closing questions today are kind of some of the questions we're going to use throughout this study that we think Psalms helps us address. Who are we? Where are we? What's wrong? What's the solution? And what time is it? So put some of your answers in the comment section, or if you just want to talk one-on-one about that, reach out to one of us. And we'll see you on Friday at 4 o'clock for session 2 of Psalms. Thanks for joining us.